Hello, I'm Elizabeth Vanicelli, and today I'm going to answer a few questions about data mining and student testing under a philosophical and ethical framework. I will present both sides of the argument using deductive logic, namely a syllogism. I will have a paramount value along with a criterion, which is a way of measuring the value. Finally, I will compare the values and the support of the values to come up with a few solid answers for me, but ultimately I want you to think about the issues and come up with your own conclusions. I recognize that I don't have the same background as anyone else, so just because I believe something is correct doesn't mean it will be true for you or even objectively true, and I want you to keep that in mind. I'll begin with some background information. From James Endicott, there has been testing in schools for years. Recently, more of this testing has become standardized. There are numerous reasons for this, such as the goal of trying to make students who graduate from schools anywhere in the country share certain minimum proficiencies. However, there are other uses of this data as well. Some uses include tying scores to teacher incentives and penalties, determining college admission and scholarships, and evaluating for special needs. The questions I am going to consider, also from Endicott, are: some schools sell this data to third-party testing companies. This helps close budget shortfalls but also invades student privacy. Does it matter that this data impacts students with special needs differently? Does it matter that only some schools are rich enough to afford the data to sell it? 2. Some private schools and tutoring locations have embraced data wholeheartedly. At these schools, every homework question, classroom question, test, sick day, and disciplinary record are stored in the school's computer. They then use predictive algorithms to identify what specifically students are struggling with and are, by many accounts, able to predict it faster and more precisely than many teachers. For example, they can predict if students are having trouble with their eighths multiplication tables. Is it reasonable to use these kinds of algorithms? What happens if an algorithm makes a mistake? Does it create unrealistic expectations for teachers to be able to address whatever deficiencies are identified? Is it okay that it takes away freedom from teachers since they will be expected to address what an algorithm tells them to do? 3. One other area of data analysis in these kinds of programs are adaptive algorithms. This can come in the form of adaptive exercises or practice, or adaptive exams. On adaptive homework, it will generate problems based on what it has detected that you are struggling with, or give you fewer questions if you aren't struggling in anything. On adaptive exams, instead of having a fixed pool of questions, each student follows a tree of paths where nodes have a pool of questions randomly selected from that are supposedly equivalent difficulty. Then the branches from it are either right or wrong answers, with right answers pointing to harder questions and wrong answers pointing to easier ones. This is how the computerized SAT works. The former is designed to help students improve themselves, and the latter is designed to help identify how skilled a student is with greater precision in a much larger pool. However, both wind up getting used for other purposes. Is it fair that some students have to do more work for homework than others? Is it fair that an early SAT question has more weight than a later one? Let's first address the background information and set up a philosophical framework. The first opportunity for discussion is that scores are tied to teachers' incentives and penalties. Let's look at the affirmative side, that this is a good thing. The value I think we should consider here is egalitarianism viewed through a consequentialist lens, the criterion. Here, when I'm discussing egalitarianism, I mean equal treatment for equal performance. When I say consequentialism, I mean evaluating the consequences, both good and bad. If we assume based on the law of averages that teachers get the same variety of students, then we can evaluate equal performance based on teachers alone. Here's the very simple syllogism. We'll get more advanced as we go along. 1. Major premise. Equal treatment for equal performance is good. 2. Minor premise. Tying scores to teachers' incentives and penalties ensures equal treatment for equal performance. 3. Conclusion. Therefore, tying scores to teachers' incentives and penalties is good. However, there is a rebuttal to that argument. Teachers don't receive the same variety of students. We live in a society where public schooling is funded by property tax, so those in less endowed neighborhoods don't have access to the same learning privileges. These students often don't have the same opportunities and materials to learn, so they are likely to not appear as smart, well-behaved, or driven, even if they are. So we see here that there is a flaw in the minor premise. There won't be equal performance across teachers. Some teachers will have to work harder for smaller results. On the negative side, meaning that this is a bad thing, I will make this argument. I'm valuing self-worth or dignity through the criterion of utilitarianism, which is similar to consequentialism. Utilitarianism is making a decision based on the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Again, it's very simple. 1. Major premise. A negative self-worth is bad. 2. Minor premise. Tying teachers' incentives and penalties to scores creates a negative self-worth. 3. Conclusion. Therefore, tying teachers' incentives and penalties to scores is bad. Here, the minor premise requires a little more explanation. Tying teachers' performance to self-worth when part of their performance, like the group of students they teach, is out of their control can create damaging effects because they may have no way to perform well. The decks may be stacked against them. Teachers' self-worth can't be tied to this because the results may be negative even if the teacher is not. However, there is a counter-argument. This time, let's target the major premise. A negative self-worth can be justified. A negative self-worth can promote improvement for the individual. A negative self-worth can be good for those reasons and more, so there is a flaw in this argument too. The next piece of background information is determining college admission and scholarships from data mining. Basically, what this means is that schools can access records of struggle, attendance, grades, standardized test scores, and etc., and create algorithms that will tell them who should be admitted or given a scholarship. The philosophical framework for the affirmative could be accountability through the criterion of Kant's first formulation of the categorical imperative. Accountability is self-explanatory. If a student does something, both good and bad, they should be held accountable for it. Kant's categorical imperative basically says things ought to be done universally. It's only okay to do something if everyone in the same situation could do it too. Now for some deductive logic. Major premise. Accountability ensures a better functioning society. Minor premise. Tracking and using students' performance ensures accountability. Conclusion. Tracking and using students' performance ensures a better functioning society. We can all agree that a better functioning society would be good. If people are held accountable, lawyers, students, criminals, whatever, then that would make everything function better, just in case that needed any clarification. But there is in fact a rebuttal to every argument. This time it is with the minor premise. Tracking and using students' performance records things that the student may not be at fault for, like a family death or disability. These may have caused great distress, but there's no way to fit subjectivity and empathy into an algorithm. The technique is flawed. On the negative side, we have two values, actually. Autonomy and privacy through a criterion of act utilitarianism, which is that each act has its own greatest utility or benefit for the greatest number of people. Major premise. Autonomy and privacy create more utility within a society. Minor premise. Tracking and using students' performance deteriorates autonomy and privacy. Conclusion. Therefore, tracking and using students' performance deteriorates utility within a society. Tracking and using students' performance may ensure accountability, but it also reduces autonomy and privacy, which may be the paramount values. It reduces autonomy and privacy by not allowing the student to disclose what he or she feels is pertinent. All of this data mining just puts everything out there. It is also dehumanizing by reducing a person to just numbers, as some food for thought. As a rebuttal to this argument, there is a flaw in the major premise. Maybe a more transparent and uniformly behaved society would be more beneficial. It would come at the cost of freedom, but maybe society would function better. On to the next background information. Data mining can evaluate for special needs. On the affirmative, we have a value of societal welfare with a criterion of sympathy. When I say I can measure this through sympathy, I mean the more sympathetic people are towards each other, especially people with special needs or disabilities, the more cooperative, supported, and understanding the community will be, which increases societal welfare. Major premise. Being sympathetic increases societal welfare. Minor premise. Acknowledging, supporting, and discovering needs for people with special needs is sympathetic. Conclusion. Therefore, acknowledging, supporting, and discovering needs for people with special needs increases societal welfare. Next, the rebuttal. This time it's with the major premise. In some instances, being sympathetic, maybe to rapists, murderers, and other morally repugnant people, can decrease societal welfare. The point of the major premise is to get everyone to agree to a broad generalization, and in this case we can't, even though it sounds obvious at first. On the negative, privacy is a good value here too. This time the criterion is freedom. Freedom is a good way to weigh privacy because people can have the freedom to disclose what they want. Major premise. The freedom to disclose personal information about oneself necessitates privacy. Minor premise. Algorithms that predict special needs and report them violates the freedom to disclose personal information about oneself. Conclusion. Therefore, algorithms that predict special needs and report them violate privacy. For the rebuttal, the flaw here is that privacy is a good thing. The same rebuttal I gave to the last privacy argument still applies. Alright, now that we've established a few values, egalitarianism via consequentialism, self-worth or dignity via utilitarianism, accountability via the first categorical imperative, autonomy or privacy via act utilitarianism, societal welfare via sympathy, and privacy via freedom, we can start to answer some questions. Question number 1. Does it matter that this data impacts students with special needs differently? Does it matter that only some schools are rich enough to afford the data to sell it? The rest of it is just here to remind you what the context is. As for the doesn't matter about the special needs part, of course it matters. The real question is, does it affect special needs students positively or negatively? Based on our framework above, with societal welfare being sympathy on the affirmative and privacy via freedom on the negative, it really depends on how you look at it. I'm inclined to say, based on my narrow background, that it impacts students with special needs positively. As a student with special needs, I think it would have been great if we had been able to figure it out sooner. I think society would benefit more if we knew more about each other and cared for each other. Yes, privacy is violated, but ultimately privacy and secrecy won't provide as much good as sympathy. Onto the does it matter about wealth part, once again, I'm inclined to say it matters. In the first philosophical framework discussion, I explained how underprivileged schools and students don't have the same opportunities and that this is a flaw in the system. It's unfortunate that not everyone has the same opportunities, but that doesn't mean that we should take away help from other people to make everyone as disadvantaged as the lowest level. Ultimately, this is part of a much larger discussion on school funding reform as opposed to data mining. Question number 2. Is it reasonable to use these kind of algorithms? What happens if an algorithm makes a mistake? Does it create unrealistic expectations for teachers to be able to address whatever deficiencies are identified? Is it okay that it takes away freedom from teachers since they will be expected to address what an algorithm tells them to do? So is it reasonable to use these kind of algorithms? Yes, it is. I'm all for letting people use whatever resources are available to them to help other people. This goes back to societal welfare. The more we can identify strengths and play to them, the more developed strengths will be. The more we can identify weaknesses, the better chance there is to fix them early. Ultimately, these algorithms can be super helpful, and it seems to me like students would appreciate the help. Well, what happens if the algorithm makes a mistake? I think that this would be an easy fix. Say an algorithm says a kid is struggling with his 8s on the multiplication table, so the teacher assigns extra relevant homework. The teacher will be able to grade to see if the student did them all correctly. The student can report how much time it took him or her. The human teacher is still there, so he or she can find mistakes and correct them. Does it create unrealistic expectations? I don't think so, especially at an early level where hopefully most deficiencies can be found. Teachers should be able to teach and counsel to a variety of skills just like they do now. Is it okay to take freedom away from teachers? Yes. Teachers should serve the students, and the best way to help students is to listen to an algorithm. Then that's what they should do. Ultimately, freedom is not the paramount value to me, but feel free to disagree. Is it fair that some students have to do more work for homework than others? Is it fair that an early SAT question has more weight than a later one? Is it fair questions are hard? Let me set one thing straight. Fairness should not be a value because the world is not fair. It is unpragmatic. However, they are relevant. It's just that different values should be in place of fair, like goodness. So is it good that some students have to do more homework? There are two sides. Yes, because it will create a smarter society, and no, because some other obligations need to come first, like helping support the family or something. However, I think in most circumstances, a student can make time to learn. In most circumstances, a young student often has time to learn as well. Once again, societal welfare and utilitarianism prevail. Is it good that an earlier SAT question has more weight than a later one? It's not a matter of earlier or later, it's a matter of difficulty. It is fair that more difficult questions receive more points, just like in regular school. So now the conclusion. Hopefully I have shown that societal welfare should prevail, at least in regards to data mining and student testing. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and that it encouraged you to think in new ways. Thank you for your time.